this is your Auntie M. Thank you for joining me. I posted a story on Reddit not too long ago and I received some very interesting responses, so I thought I would try something a little different and share it here with you. So, a few years back, after an unfortunate divorce, I kind of ended up homeless and living in an RV for about a year. My ex had left very unexpectedly and had cleaned out the bank account when he went, and that meant I lost the place where we were staying. And the RV was about 30 years old and really, honestly, all I could afford at the time. Shortly after this occurred, I was offered a job 3,000 miles away from my ex-husband, and it seemed like a good idea at the time to get as far away from him as possible because he was doing some very aggressive things like slashing my water line. So I packed up my 2 small dogs and I started driving west. I was moving from just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, to a very small town in Northern California. This is about a week-long drive, particularly in an older vehicle, and it did have a few issues, including a bad thermostat, which meant the radiator overheated on a regular basis. So it was about 4 days into our trip, and we were in western New Mexico. We just recently passed Albuquerque, and we stopped at the Sky City Casino and RV Park for overnight. Now, I would like to say this RV park is one of the nicest ones I stayed in on that trip. The bathhouse is huge, it was very comfortable, the park grounds were well taken care of, and the view was absolutely spectacular. It is very much designed to be a place where tourists don't realize that they are next to thousands of miles of untracked wilderness desert. It is on the Acoma Pueblo Reservation in western New Mexico, and if you do get a chance to stop by, enjoy it thoroughly. At the time, I was just glad that they weren't turning us out for being in an older, uglier RV, because one of the things that no one tells you about RV living is it's only okay if you can make it very apparent that you don't need to be doing it. So we spent our night and we were preparing to go on with our journey. And the next morning I looked outside and decided I needed to scout the area before I let my dogs out for their morning constitutional. And as I got out and walked around, I saw a coyote sniffing around the park. And since I do have some experience with canines, I knew better than to meet its eyes. And since I do have some experience with things that aren't quite human, I knew to greet it politely when I walked by and went to the bathhouse. And as I came back out, I saw he was still there. Now, my dogs are very, very tiny. We're talking toy poodles here. And they would be a very, very good coyote snack. So I looked at the coyote, and I very politely told him that I had 2 small dogs who needed to come out, and it would be greatly appreciated if he would give us space to do so that they could do so in safety and comfort. And the coyote kind of huffed at me, and he started walking down the dirt road. And after about 30 feet, he stopped, and he looked back over his shoulder at me. Obviously, that's an invitation. So I started down the dirt track after him. I was very careful to leave him a great deal of personal space, and I watched where he was going. I was also very careful not to leave the dirt track. So I followed the coyote a little bit, and within sight of the RV park were 3 very large boulders on the desert floor. And the coyote went around behind the boulders, and I watched him go. And then, walking back out on the other side at the same speed that the coyote had been moving at, was an older native gentleman. He was wearing a blue plaid shirt and very worn blue jeans. His hair was in braids, and he was wearing a woven cowboy hat. Looked like it had been made of grass. And he smiled, and he tipped his hat at me, and he turned and he walked off into the desert. And as he did that, A raven that I hadn't noticed that was perched on top of the tallest of the three boulders started laughing at me. And if you've ever heard a raven laugh, you know that's the best way to describe it. It's not just, a caw. They're laughing at you. And then the raven took off, flying directly towards the man who was walking east into the desert. And due to a trick of the rising sun, the raven appeared to shift from being a black bird to a white one, and then it appeared to be a brilliant orangey red. Well, at this point, I decided that I had had quite enough of trickster spirits for the day. I recognized that had I been less polite, that entire encounter could have ended in a much less pleasant fashion. But I went back to the RV. I'd let my dogs out in safety. And then we packed up and got out of there as quickly as we could. Later that day, we broke down in the Mojave Desert, and that was when I noticed that I was being followed by ravens. Not just one, an entire flock of them. And some of those ravens kept me company all the way through the Mojave Desert to Los Angeles, and then up through Central California into a little town about 2 hours north of Sacramento. And the entire time I was living in that little town north of Sacramento, whenever I would go outside of my RV and say, take the mile walk to work, there were 3 ravens that would go with me. They would very happily pace me as I was walking. And I have to admit, it did add quite a bit of flavor to living in that part of California. So that is my story of an encounter with some form of trickster spirit. I'm still not sure if it was, Coyote trickster, or if it was one of the walkers, or what. But I was very fortunate to get off as easily as I did. And now I leave it to you to decide if this story is true or not. I know my truth. Thank you for joining me, and you have a beautiful rest of your day.